Mary, thanks. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen in just a second. For those of you who, oops, can you see the slides?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Roberto. I'm a lecturer in criminology at Liverpool Hope University. And I was born in Italy, but I moved to the UK when I was 18, and then I spent a good chunk of the last 15 years in Australia. So in case you were wondering about my accent, that's a mixture of Italian English and Australian. I want you to focus on the content of what I say rather than sort of wondering about my accent. And essentially in this presentation, what I want to talk about is the fact that back in the 70s, when radical/critical criminology first emerged in the United States and the UK, history seemed to play quite a relevant role in the development of early critical criminology. And I'm going to focus on what happened at the Berkeley School of Criminology in the US, sort of as a case study. And this is based on a paper that I published last year. But I don't want to just provide a summary of the paper. Rather, I want to take sort of the opportunity to engage with some of the data and the things that I discovered when I went back to sort of study the attitude and research culture of these scholars, to sort of engage in sort of a more general conversation about the relationship between history and criminology, and about the place of history in critical criminology more specifically. So in a nutshell, what I want to talk about today is sort of first give you a bit of a clue as to how to do research in this area, tell you a little bit about the background to the research, if you like, why I think it's important and interesting and worth some thoughts with you, how it is part of a large project that I've been sort of working on since really since my PhD back in 2016. And I'm going to focus in particular on the way that historical research was used by critical criminologists at the University of California, Berkeley, back in the 70s, mostly in the first half of the 70s, because in 76 the school was shut down because criminology had become too political. Interestingly, Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California at the time, was instrumental in shutting down the school. And perhaps we can sort of come back to the relationship between history as an academic discipline and the political climate of the day, since, as you all know, Trump won the American election, and maybe there's a way to connect some of this stuff to contemporary events. And I also want to say a few words about how things developed rather differently, as far as I can see, in the United Kingdom when it comes to the ways in which early critical criminologists engage with history. And depending on how I do with time, I sort of want to explore that particular point. And by the way, I'm going to try and aim to be done within 45 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. And I'm going to end by sort of offering some general reflections about what this case study, if you like, tells us about critical criminology and its relationship with history, and what it tells us about historical criminology and its relationship with critique and radicalism. So essentially, since 2016, when I started my PhD, most of my research has been sort of devoted to understanding the relationship between history and criminology, but most of my research really being around sort of the theory and practice of criminology, really trying to understand what's history to do with criminology, if you like, is really my overarching research question. And my PhD was sort of an attempt to articulate a distinction in the way in which historians study crime and the way that criminologists engage with history. And to me, the sort of the main intention has always been that criminology is very much a practical and applied discipline concerned with a very real and concrete and practical problem. And this has always kind of discouraged historical work and research in the discipline. It's obviously a bit of an oversimplification, but it sort of gives you an idea of sort of the general orientation of my research over the past few years. And so I've sort of tried to engage with historiographic concepts and sort of see how they can be used in criminology, like historicism, presentism. I've looked at authors who have been accused of being this kind of presentist writers in sort of historical criminology, like Krasinovich and Foucault. I've also tried to place the development of a historical interest in criminology in sort of broader within sort of a broader set of epistemic shifts and changes within the social sciences and the development of a historical social science in the second half of the 20th century. And more recently, I've even decided to go as far back as Lombroso and sort of try and understand and analyze the relevance of historical research in his own work. A related area of research that I've been focusing on is to just write the history of historical criminology, starting with a paper I published a couple of years ago, who gave historical criminology a name. And that's really where I started to realize that there was something interesting about the relationship between history and critical criminology, because the point of that study was to sort of trace the use of the word, of the phrase historical criminology back in time and say, well, who's been using this designation to describe the work, and how have they done it, and so on. And sort of the main finding of that study was that it's been used for over 100 years, but there isn't really a single tradition of scholars that self-identify as historical criminologists. It's very much a new thing in that regard. But I did notice that something changed somewhat in the 70s, and that had to do with the rise of critical criminology, that in that context, people started to engage, critical criminology started to engage with historical material in a more consistent and systematic fashion. And that's how I got interested in sort of the critical uses of history at Berkeley in the United States, but I've also done some work on the United Kingdom, as I mentioned. And then I've also explored some other areas sort of at the intersection of history and critical criminology, more specifically with a focus, for instance, on the Antipodean and the Global South. And what I'm working on at the moment is sort of the way in which historical perspectives can enrich our understanding of all kinds of different areas of inquiry in critical criminology, like state crime, and particularly at the moment, I'm looking at a lot of sort of historical works on corporate crime. There's also a more immediate sort of reason why I became interested in Berkeley, and sort of that has to do with sort of an instance of what I like to call teaching-informed research, as opposed to research-informed teaching. Essentially, what I mean by that is that when I first joined Liverpool Hope University back in 2020, I was fortunate enough to have enough discretion to make sort of a independent contribution to the curriculum, and I decided to introduce a 24-week sort of lecture series on critical criminology. And as part of that course, I basically I had to prepare a couple of lectures on the history and origins of critical criminology, which I did in the US and the UK. And I went back to sort of the very first critical criminology courses offered to undergraduate students in the US. And I noticed that there was a lot of history in them. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. And that also led me to further explore the place of history in critical criminology. And again, I'll sort of tell you in just a moment sort of some of the differences that I found in the US versus the UK. And you can read about sort of this story in a paper that I published in the Journal of Justice, Power and Resistance last year. The paper is titled History as Activism, Critical Uses of History at the Berkeley School of Criminology in the 70s, where I essentially make the following claim. Back in the 60s and 70s, radicalism was penetrating virtually every single field of academic inquiry. It was just a time of counterculture and a time of progressive, really repositioning across society as a whole, where the struggles of the new left and Marxism really became sort of a dominant force in academia. And so the fact that criminology was radicalized in this period isn't particularly surprising per se, although Tony Platt made the point that that is an interesting question in and of itself, because of the fact that criminology has historically been a very conservative discipline. And so the fact that it got radicalized is an interesting question in a way. But to me personally, what was fascinating is not the fact that critical criminology emerged at this particular point in time, but the fact that doing historical research came to be seen as an important aspect of this process of radicalization of the discipline. And sort of that's really what I wanted to understand, sort of the aspects of this process of radicalization where history played an important role. And as I said, I noticed that, for instance, the kind of teaching that was provided to students at the time at Berkeley was infused with historical material, with Paul Takagi, who's been teaching, was teaching as early as 1969 about sort of the history of corrections, very much using the kind of political, economic perspectives that you might be familiar by reading the work of Reich and Kirchheimer and so on. And I'll focus specifically on a course that was redesigned by Takagi together with Tony Platt and Barry Kreisberg, Criminology 100 AB, in just a moment, to give an idea of the kind of historical emphasis in the teaching provision. And more generally, it's just clear to me that the overarching research culture at Berkeley was very much, if not necessarily dominated by historical lines of inquiry, history was definitely a significant part of it. There was a strong historical orientation in the publications that came out of the Berkeley School at the time, the doctoral thesis produced there at the time, and so on. And now, keep in mind, I didn't write the proper history. I'm not a historian. I'm a critical and historical criminologist. I wasn't particularly interested in writing the history of the school as such. This is something that's been done extensively by others. And it's an interesting story, and I'll tell you bits and pieces of it, but only the most relevant ones. What I was more interested in was sort of write, if you like, a chapter in the history of historical criminology. So my question really was, did early critical criminologists practice a historical criminology, however defined? And if so, can we sort of detect different ways of using history, and what are they? And in so doing, I really wanted to sort of initiate a conversation about the fact that to this day, it seems to me that most people take for granted that what distinguishes critical criminology is its politics, the fact that it is a political way of doing criminology. But what I've come to the conclusion, essentially, that back in the 70s, many critical criminologists understood that the purpose of a critical criminology was to bring not just politics, but also history back into criminology. And so some of my work has really been about emphasizing the importance of this coupling of history and politics for critical criminology, and how we need to move towards a critical historical criminology. And the kind of romanticized version of the truth that I sort of narrate in the paper History and as Activism goes something like this. Back in the 60s, virtually all of the social sciences were very much ahistorical, whether you look at sociology or anthropology or criminology. But this was the time where we see sort of a process Eric Hobsbawm calls the historicization of the social sciences, and sort of that went hand in hand with the scientification of history. And so all of the social sciences started to pay more attention to historical to history as essential, but within each discipline, not everyone really did that. And in criminology in the US, it was the radical criminologists at Berkeley School who were really doing a lot of the historical work, while in other parts of the country, in the words of Tony Platt, criminologists were, for the most part, quote, constructing useless prediction tables. Just so you know, I'm going to use that citation with Curry 73 a few times. That's actually Tony Platt speaking in an interview with Elliot Curry. And so that this was really the cradle of historical criminology. Historical criminology is something that we can trace back, at least in its self-conscious form, back to the origins of critical criminology itself, and at the same time, this was also critical criminology at its best. Critical criminology at its best was the critical criminology of the 70s that took for granted that critical criminology was historical criminology, that it was a criminology that functioned as a political site where historical analysis of law, crime, justice, and so on could be developed. Again, that's a romantic version of the story, because the story is actually more complex than that, but that sort of gives you an idea where I'm coming from. Now, hopefully I don't need to spend much time sort of on the broader context and the sort of political and social and economic forces at play back in the late 60s and 70s. You all familiar with the fact that these were turbulent political times, times of counter-culture, sort of the rise of mass protests, mass social movements, the economic boom that followed World War II in the US was starting to wane, and there were penal crises in different countries, notably in '71 in the United States, the Attica Rebellion and so on. And this was the time when the New Left really launched an impressive battle on different fronts: the civil rights movements, the anti-war and anti-imperialist movements, the student movement, and so on. Activists and grassroots movements were fighting simultaneously these different fights against oppression and racism and sexism and classism, and the critical criminologists of the time were essentially activists that were interested in using their craft to try and participate in these political debates and to contribute to their resolution, essentially. Which is really why I'm interested in this question of how can it be that history came to play such a prominent role in their work? If they were activists that were interested in the struggles against oppression, why would they develop an interest in history? Why would they write historical works? And I'll come back to that in just a second. The point is that these political upheavals in the 60s had an impact on the structure of the school, of the Berkeley School of Criminology, which essentially had been established in the early 20th century, and particularly from the 30s onwards, had been used as essentially a training center for police officers under the guidance of August Vollmer. And it stayed essentially as such well into the 50s, which is, however, a period where the administration, sort of the vision of the school, became increasingly fragmented. We start seeing this kind of administrative, vocational criminology sort of being flanked by other wings, if you like, the sort of law and society wing first, and then eventually in later on the radical criminology that kind of emerged in part because of the dissatisfaction with sort of the neutrality of the law and society scholarship, as well as obviously the various political influences that I just mentioned, and Marxism and so on. And it was really from the late 60s to 1976, when the school was shut down, that the Berkeley School became sort of the epicenter of sort of criminological radicalism in the United States. That's where sort of most of this exciting historical work happened. As I mentioned, in that period, and by the time that the school was shut down, there were really three wings at the Berkeley School, and I'm going to focus essentially on what I'm focusing on is the work of the radical criminologists. And again, the three wings were sort of the administrative cream that was interested in sort of law enforcement and police education, and a very much kind of defenders of the status quo, friends of the state, who were just providing vocational training to practitioners of criminal justice. This kind of more centrist liberal Democrats that were doing work in law and society, really trying to understand law as a social institution rather than studying jurisprudence more specifically. They kind of tended to work with a legal definition of crime. They were not particularly political and so on. And this is obviously sort of a bit of a caricature, if you like. There was a lot of collaboration among, say, law and society scholars and radical criminologists and so on, and between administrative criminologists and law and society scholars. And the radicals were essentially this kind of very much active activists, Marxists, political thinkers who were skeptical of sort of traditional way of doing criminology, really calling for radical structural change rather than rather than espousing a reformist mindset. And they are the ones that came to be seen as really sort of enemies of the state. And they are singled out as the reason why the school was shut down, which raises an interesting question, which is to what extent was history implicating in the shutting down of the school? Because if one of sort of the signature of these radical criminologists is that they were doing historical work, then I think it's fair to sort of pose that question. And sort of the predominant moment where this kind of radicalism emerged, Berkeley, as I said, is really the first half of the 70s. That's where most of the radical stuff happened. These radical criminologists created a union of radical criminologists in 72. They redesigned part of the curriculum to sort of introduce the very first critical criminology course to be offered to undergraduate students in the States. They started research center, they launched journals to publish radical work. And interestingly, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, this wasn't just a US American phenomenon, it was international in scope, but there's also something else to be said here, which is there's nothing particularly unique about radicalism in criminology. If you look at the period, say, from 69 to sort of the early 70s, political economists, historians, sociologists, they all created radical unions. They all created the first sort of radical journals in history and sociology and so on. So this was sort of what the radicalism at Berkeley was in line with sort of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. When it comes to the curriculum, this is the course that I found that really inspired me to do some further research on this question of how relevant was history to this early critical criminologist at Berkeley. It's called Criminology 100 AB, and essentially it was used to be just a mainstream introduction to criminology that Tony Platt and Paul Takajanberg CRISPR redesigned along critical lines. And it was taught over 2 semesters, Criminology 100A in semester 1, Criminology 100B in semester 2. And Criminology 100A was not really historical in orientation, but you can definitely see sort of the political part of critical crim sort of informing that part of the curriculum. Okay, it's all about crimes of imperialism, racism, sexism, crimes by the state. It was the second semester there was historical in orientation, Criminology 100B. This was the part of the curriculum of the course that was essentially centered on the progressive era from the sort of the last 2 decades and the first 2 decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And the reason for that is that this was the time when sort of the modern criminal justice system consolidated in the States. There were a lot of struggles going on at the time, and the point was to use these historical foundations, in the words of Berkeley CRISPR, to then discuss and critique sort of the liberal theories and so on. And so I thought it was quite fascinating when I found out about this course that is essentially based around 2 key areas. Activism on the one hand, politics/activism, political agency, and history. It's quite clear that sort of really the 2 axes of the course, kind of history and activism. That, you know, it's pretty clear to me that history was playing a fundamental pedagogic role in this course. Beyond sort of the sort of the pedagogy, the fact that history influenced, you know, was part of the teaching that was offered to students. There's also a strong research culture that was very much interested in producing historical works. I personally focused predominantly on the work of Tony Platt and Paul Takajanberg CRISPR, as well as the work of doctoral students. But there were many more scholars that deserved to be sort of studied in this context. I mean, think about the fact that, for instance, Dario Malossi was at Berkeley for a little while, and when he returned to Europe. Eventually, he published *The Prison and the Factory*, which is essentially the Italian version of Foucault's *Discipline and Punish*, first in Italian in the late 70s. But yes, so it wasn't necessarily a comprehensive study that I did, and it'd be interesting to sort of further sort of explore, in particular, the fact that a lot of historically informed critiques were produced at the time, which have sort of the ones that I've listed there at the bottom of the slide, which I've not really had sort of the time to investigate in terms of, was this a collective effort in some way, or are this just single instances of authors that are just using history for their own purposes and they're not really part of a shared research program? These are some of the doctoral theses that were produced at Berkeley between the late 60s and sort of the mid 70s. Probably most of you will have heard of Tony Platt's *The Child Saver*. Was really at the time the it became really the most sort of fierce critique of the prevailing wisdom of the sort of the child saving movements and its sort of enlightened character. Greg Barak did something similar in his doctoral thesis on the public defender system, sort of making a similar claim that these are kind of revisionist histories, if you like, that they were not sort of motivated by progressive and humanitarian efforts. There was something else going on and so on. Clements also did quite an interesting study of the San Francisco maritime and general strikes of 1934. And what's interesting about her doctoral thesis is that she explicitly states that the reason that she got interested in sort of in this particular topic was because of the police repression that she witnessed on campus at Berkeley while she was a student there. And that's what incentivized her and motivated her to sort of use a historical case study to sort of study sort of some of the general principles of the dynamics of repression more generally. And also quite a few histories of criminology as a discipline were produced, none of which can just be understood as sort of intellectual histories or intellectual history, but these were really attempts to sort of self-reflectively ask the question, who are we today as criminologists? In other words, as Tony Platt puts it, the building of a radical perspective requires a self-critical analysis of criminologist development during the last 100 years. And I think that a lot of these doctoral students, that's exactly what they were doing. They were really inquiring into their own positionality as sort of emerging criminologists and so on. There were a bunch of other works that also clearly some kind of historical orientation. So now my question is, how do we explain this? And just so you know, I can't see the chat, but I'll, just in case you were asking a question, I'm not answering in real time just because I can't see. My question is, at this point is, well, why then, why developing an interest in history if these were radical Marxists interested in activism and so on? This is essentially the conventional way of understanding the emergence of this radical paradigm in criminology back in the 70s. The idea is that these were activists, these were politically engaged academics, very much part of the movement of the New Left, who wanted to make a political contribution more than anything else. So why turn to history as a way of doing activism? Why writing historical studies of the public defender, of the child savers movement, of policing, of the convict lease system, of drug prohibition, of racism, of coloniality, and so on? And the point, I think, is that to them, it was clear that history, there was political potential in history. They had a very political view of history. And I think that's, perhaps we can come back to this, whether this is a problem even of itself, whether there's a distinction that can be made between a political use of history and a politicized use of history. But we can come back to this particular question in the Q&A if you're interested. The one thing that I wanted to mention is that I think it's a bit too easy to say, well, there's an obvious reason why they developed an interest in history, and that has to do with Marxism. Marxism was extremely influential at the time, and historical materialism is really the backbone of Marxist analysis. If you add to that the influence of British Marxist historians who were doing a lot of work on sort of crime and criminal justice and criminal law, that kind of explains how historical materialism and class analysis became important elements of critical analysis in criminology. I think that's true, but only to an extent, as Tony Platt himself make clear. That was part of the story. It was part, but it's not the whole. Marxism does not tell us the whole story. These were scholars who were motivated to do history because, in the words of Platt, quote, the anti-war and civil rights and later feminist movements compelled us to investigate the historical roots of American militarism, imperialism, racism, and sexism. But I do think that there are some there are reasons why historical materialism played an important role here. And one is that, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, that historical materialism really allows us to denaturalize crime, to sort of move beyond the Lombrosian way of looking at crime as a natural phenomenon. And politically, it also helps us stay optimistic about the possibility of eradicating crime, because if crime is not a natural but a historical phenomenon, then it just logically follows that it is something that we can eradicate if we do the right political things. But in a way, historical materialism, I think, does explain a lot of what was happening in one specific sense, and that is, if it is true that the correct way to understand history is to sort of look at the tensions at the level of material forces and so on, then we can appreciate there was something specific to that historical moment, to the 70s, that sort of created the urgency for a sort of radical reinterpretation of the past in a moment of crisis, in a moment of danger, in a moment of need. As Walter Benjamin puts it in his thesis on the philosophy of history, quote, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. And that's kind of what historical materialism does in a sense. It really helps you to engage with history in a moment of crisis, rather than to sort of understand history as this kind of conservative disciplines that people do kind of as a hobby, if you like. At the same time, that also tells us something about the historicity of critique itself. There's a sense in which the radical spirit of the time was itself a product of the historical of that historical moment. The critique is itself sort of a historically situated practice and a historical event. And in a way, this is what the radical criminologists of the time were doing. They were doing essentially, in the words of one of them, quote, an analysis of historical relations rooted in the daily experiences of the period. But as I said, at the same time, historical materialism was part of the answer, but it wasn't the only answer to the question why these early criminologists developed an interest in history. And I think there's at least a couple of other points that need to be made here. One is that at the time of the emergence of critical criminology, there's simply a move away from the dominant traditions in criminology, like classicism and positivism, and these were not particularly historical traditions. And so doing historical work sort of came to be seen as sort of an oppositional move. And so it really became a way of practicing the kind of anti-criminology, the kind of, in the words of Stanley Cohen, the kind of criminology against criminology that developed at the time. And note that this is not necessarily the case in the United Kingdom, as I'll show you in a moment. In the United Kingdom, the conditions were not there for radical critical criminologists in the 70s to use history that way, because the sort of the big names in the discipline in the mid-20th century were actually quite keen to do a bit of historical work. The other thing is that history was not necessarily was not seen as the only way to make criminology critical, but it was an important piece of the puzzle. And as you'll see in just a moment, to some, it was the most important piece of the puzzle. But the idea is that these engaged activists, they used history as sort of part of a broader package to do activism. So it wasn't just a method, it just wasn't just a way of doing research, it was a political weapon. It was a way of doing activism, essentially. It was a way of linking historical scholarship and political activism, and sort of studying the origins and developments of social problems and today's injustices. And so to sort of fight this political battle, both at sort of on the level of political activism today, but also the level of historical revisionism. Okay, so it was a way for them to be more informed as they were acting as political agents in the political field. And in that context, I think that history came to play at least half a dozen different roles. So these are sort of the roles that I've isolated, and I'm going to briefly discuss the fact that history became an important tool to demystify crime and criminal justice, to sort of remind them of the artificiality of disciplinary boundaries and to study crime holistically instead, to connect historical memory and political agency, and to connect past and present struggles, to ridicule the naturalistic kind of Lombrosian explanations of crime, and to sort of imagine social change. So I'll just very briefly go through each of those sort of roles that history played for these early critical criminologists. The first view about sort of demystifying criminal justice, we can also think of it as a form of historical essentialism, in the sense that at the time, particularly I found this to be a shared views amongst graduate students. There was a sense that the only way that you can understand crime and criminal justice is through the development of a historical perspective. And so I found loads and loads of quotes that use this kind of essentialistic way of saying a critical criminology requires a historical perspective. There's a need for historical scholarship in criminology. It is only through the use of a historical perspective, says Barak, that we can understand the functioning and development of criminal justice. And essentially what this means is that in criminology, a perspective is critical when it looks at things in historical perspective, when it looks at the origins and the historical development of the criminal justice system, its agencies, and so on. The second role of history emphasizes that disciplines are essentially fake. They are, in the eyes of the radicals at Berkeley, actually ideological tools. This notion that disciplinary boundaries are essentially fake and obsolete was not invented by them. It's something that goes to the social science of the late 19th century in America, where scientists were basically so optimistic about science that they were particularly concerned about where a particular notion or theory was coming from. They were basically merging all of their know-how and expertise to try and solve society's social problems. And Immanuel Wallerstein has popularized his own version of sort of this notion, which he calls unidisciplinarity, just sort of a way to sort of look at kind of with some critical eye, sort of the notion of interdisciplinarity, which is so revered today. The point, I think, for radical criminologists back in the 70s was not to fixate on the fact that, you know, we are criminologists and what our task is, they are sociologists, so they are historians and so on. It was about studying crime holistically, combine a historical perspective, international perspective, and political economic perspectives, and integrate them. And in this process, I think the fact that mainstream criminology did not make use of a historical lens came to be seen as particularly problematic behavior. A third role that history played back then at the Berkeley School was to connect historical memory and political agency. This is one of my favorite quotes, and this is again this Tony Platt in dialogue with Elliot Curry in an interview for Issues in Criminology. He was asked, what does it mean to be a radical criminologist? And this is what he said, which I think is a sort of really the perfect instantiation of this notion that historical memory can connect to political agency and inform it, and that political agency can embody historical memory. said, quote, "We need to develop a deep understanding of what criminology has been in the past. We are just beginning to realize that criminology has serviced domestic repression in the same way that economics, political science, and anthropology have greased the wheels and even manufactured some of the important parts of modern imperialism. The modern criminal justice system was built with the active involvement of criminology. And given the ways in which this system has been used to repress and maintain the powerlessness of poor people, workers, people of color, and young people, it is not too far-fetched to characterize many criminologists as domestic war criminals. And radical criminology, this new emerging criminology of the 70s, must understand and reject the role we have played historically as architects of repression." And so you can see here that there's a way in which history was being utilized politically, not only to understand better the institutions of criminal justice in the present, but also to better understand ourselves as criminologists today. I'm kind of reminded of something that Heidegger said, which is to study the past cannot be but to understand ourselves, not in the sense that we might establish a number of facts about ourselves, but that we experience what we ought to be. And I think that there was similarly sort of this sense, a sense of normative commitment, if you like, to history. And so once you understand the troubled history of criminology, you're able to take a particular normative political stance. Similarly, history played the role of connecting past and present struggles. This is clear in a number of places. Probably the most obvious one is the very first issue of Crime and Social Justice. Tony Platt writes a paper titled Praxis, where essentially he condemns his colleagues for sort of ignoring history and sort of earlier forms of resistance. And he critiques sort of the liberal academic establishments that studies history just for the sake of knowing the past, and in so doing it disconnects us from our historical roots, and sort of made a call to arms, if you like, saying that Crime and Social Justice was interested in publishing precisely that kind of historical research, the kind of historical research that, quote, could help us develop, quote, a sense of political continuity with earlier struggles against the state, to better understand strategies of resistance and to relate the lessons of past to present experiences. And I mean, if you just think about the way in which history has become such a contentious academic site today in the United States, particularly due to critical race theory. I mean, history books are literally being banned. It is quite obvious to me that this sort of particular use of history, this critical use of history, is quite popular these days. And activists in all kinds of fields are essentially writing historical works as a way of reimagining the present rather than to glorify it. I can't think of a single major struggle where this isn't being done. I mean, if you think about all the work on racism, it all goes back to sort of the historical legacies of slavery and so on. Anyone who studied drug prohibition will know that you can't separate it from the history of racism and so on. If you want to understand the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the United States and Canada, New Zealand and Australia, you have to study and understand the history of settler colonialism and so on. Next, history really served the role of sort of emphasizing the need to sort of move away from the naturalistic framework popularized by Lombroso. And I don't have time to sort of get into the details on this because it's quite complicated, but essentially Lombroso, his entire work is, in my view, and this is something that I'm currently researching, is an attempt to essentially establish that crime is not something that we create through, say, it's not a legal artifact. It's not a legal phenomenon. Crime is a natural phenomenon that you can trace back not only to sort of atavistic, sort of less developed species, but even the animal, the animal world and plants. And so in using this naturalistic framework, Lombroso is essentially saying that crime is a natural rather than historical phenomenon. Whereas the radical criminologists at the Berkeley School understood quite clearly that that's not what crime is. Crime is not an inevitable manifestation of human nature, as a undergraduate student at Berkeley put it, but rather a product of historical circumstances. And there's a lot of interesting work, well, that needs to be done. It hasn't been done yet. And sort of studying the debates between Lombroso and his socialist contemporaries who made exactly that point. And the reason I think why that's interesting, it's because not only does the kind of the socialist sort of counter argument that essentially said, look, crime is not a natural phenomenon, crime is a political phenomenon. Because crime is a political phenomenon, you have to study it historically. You have to study the historical trajectory that led particular acts to be criminalized, particular societal reactions to develop, and so on. And that's also what I meant earlier when I said, once we understand that crime is not a natural phenomenon, but a political one, that also gives us the optimism and the energy to actually try and change criminal justice policy and penal policy and so on, because we're not resigned to sort of the view that crime is inevitable, that it is just a product of human nature. And lastly, history works as a form of therapy, if you like, so some kind of therapeutic device that helps us stay hopeful, even in times of crisis, in times where the prospects for change seem absent. Or in the words of Angela Davis, history works as a source of hope that helps us to refuse to attribute any kind of permanency to that which is. And so if you think about it sort of in overall, it's quite clear to me that these radical criminologists were not engaging in a conventional historiographic exercise. I think Barry Crisberg puts it best when he says that they were trying to avoid at one and the same time both the kind of ahistorical ideology of liberals who essentially don't really care about history and that kind of provide this kinds of ahistorical analysis, but also the posture of traditionalist historians who act essentially as quote unquote only historians. So this was an applied, again, I don't particularly like the notion of an applied history here, but it was a political history, was an understanding of history as essential to participating in politics today, hence history as activism. As I mentioned earlier, the school was shut down in 1976 with the help of Ronald Reagan. Was history implicated in the shutdown of the school? In other words, is the fact that these early radical criminologists at Berkeley were engaged in this kind of radical historical revisionism and so on, did that play a role in the shutting down of the Berkeley School? How dangerous is history? And one of the most prominent scholars from Berkeley, I think, puts it best in an interview with Virginia Grabner, when she says, and this is Bertrand, who says, quote, "Phasing out schools which develop a historical and critical perspective is one of the ways by which the state can coerce schools of criminology into training petty, servile professionals," quote unquote. Once again, notice historical and critical, again, go hand in hand here. It's also quite interesting that when the announcement was made in 1974 that the school was going to be shut down, it actually galvanized members of the radical wing to do even more historical work. So this was sort of the gap reaction of members of the radical wing when the school closure was announced. They said, quote, "The repressive tactics used against the school have only served to lend greater impetus to our determination to talk about the history of racial, sexual, and class oppression in America." Let me just perhaps 10 minutes, if I can, sort of saying a few things about the UK, because I think it's quite interesting to engage in a bit of a comparative exercise, because I've sort of implied here that there was a symbiotic relationship between history and critique when it comes to the emergence of radical criminology in the United States. I don't know that I can make the same claim about the UK, although for quite some time I was convinced that this was possible. but at the moment I'm sort of I think I'm sort of revising a bit my take on this, and so take this as sort of provisional, if you like. But the point is, to a very large extent, if you look at the socio-historical context in the UK over the same sort of period from World War II, the end of World War II, to the 70s, we find a similar pattern, perhaps with the only exception being sort of the economic situation, which was obviously much more desperate in the UK for obvious reasons. It had suffered greatly because of the war. But when it comes to sort of the emergence of the new left and sort of the political nature of all of these different fights against uh, different forms of oppression and inequalities and so on, as well as the emergence of an antagonism between sort of an old criminology and a new criminology, all of these ingredients were there. And so it is kind of surprising in a way that in the UK, critical criminologists in the 70s did not end up really doing the kind of history as activism that I've been able that we're able to see in the United States. And so here there are really two positions. One is the one that David Downs, for instance, thinks is correct, which is that this kind of encounter between criminology and history, and he had in mind particularly sort of the social history of British Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson, that happened in the 70s was kind of coincidental. It wasn't some kind of organic or symbiotic in any way. Whereas Stanley Cohen has a sort of a more positive sort of way of understanding, a more symbiotic way of understanding this relationship, because he says that essentially what critical criminologists were doing back then was essentially the same as what British Marxist historians were doing in terms of rescuing today's deviants from the waste bin of social pathology, or rescuing machine breakers and food rioters and poachers from the enormous condescension of posterity. It was this kind of, if you like, romanticization of deviance and sort of siding with the oppressed that really sort of that justifies the possibility that there was some kind of symbiosis. But again, it's very complicated, I think, in the UK. This is just to give you an idea. Paul Rock, this is sorry for the long quotes, by the way, but it's just, I found it so fascinating here. This is a quote from Paul Rock, who was invited by David Churchill back in 2018 to give a talk about the place of history in British criminology in London. And he presented a very interesting paper. He sent me a copy, and in the paper he essentially talks about historical work on crime done by essentially people other than criminologists. And so at some point towards the end of the paper, he says, perhaps I should have called this paper "The Place of Historical Work Outside British Criminology." And then he goes on to say something that I find quite revealing, which is when he organized a conference for the British Sociological Association together with Mary McIntosh, who, by the way, is one of the few critical criminologists from the time that did do a fair bit of historical work. They essentially invited E.P. Thompson, George Ruday, Eric Hobsbawm, and all of these social historians that they were influenced by, and quote unquote, not one of those whom we approached accepted our invitation. And so again, perhaps there was an interest, critical criminologists were interested in history, but historians were not particularly interested in critical criminology. I don't know what my take is on that as of now. But what I can say quite conclusively is that it's clear to me that the enthusiasm for history that we find in the US was not the same in the UK. And so this is a quote from, I should have used the actual publication here, but this is from the original book, The New Criminology by Taylor, Walton and Young. And towards the end of the book, they essentially admit that they have regularly throughout the book emphasized the need for historical perspectives in criminology, perspectives that are, quote, almost totally absent in existing criminological theory, and yet we've not had the space here to enter into a detailed historical explanation. So how can you possibly be interested in history and proclaim that you think that history is essential to understand crime-related phenomena, but then not do historical work of some kind. Does that mean, and I'll be done in just 5 minutes, and does that mean that critical criminology in Britain developed was ahistorical? I think it's not that simple. As I sort of hinted at earlier, sort of the big names in criminology in the mid-20th century were Radzinovich, Mannheim, and Grunert at the London School of Economics, Oxford, and Cambridge. And they were not particularly inimical to history. In fact, I have a paper under review that, among other things, sort of compares their non-critical uses of history with the more critical uses of history that developed, thanks to critical criminologists in Britain. And so, but the point is that doing history wasn't really an oppositional thing to do in Britain, because the big guys in the country, particular Radzinovich in particular, was labeled by some as a penal historian. But it is clear that there was this kind of shift from pre-critical to critical uses of history. And I can tell you a little bit more about that if you're interested in the Q&A. But to me, the sense that I have is that critical criminologists in Britain were primarily interested in history because of its potential to make criminology more sociological. So it was more of a theoretical device that they used essentially to make the sociology of deviance more historical. But to compare to them, they did understand that the crime is a historical phenomenon. This is something that you find repeatedly in the work of Taylor, Walton, and Young. This is from a paper titled Towards a Critical Criminology, where essentially say, quote, the analysis of particular forms of crime outside of their context in history and society has been shown, in our view, to be a meaningless activity. And if that's not a manifesto for a historical criminology, I don't know what is. Not only did they understand that crime is a historical phenomenon, they understood that criminology is a historically situated practice, that the kind of truth that criminology comes up with are themselves not eternal, they are historically specific and so on. And so again, I'm not entirely sure what my take is on the UK at the moment, and I want to wait and see whether this paper gets published. I want to go through a scholarly process first before I sort of make more conclusive comments on it. So let me just end by saying, was this kind of historical research program that we saw develop at the Berkeley School back in the 70s, was this historical criminology? I mean, I like to think that it was, but there's always a bit of an issue when you sort of look at the past with an eye upon the present. And in a way, I'm content to say that historical criminology, maybe this thing that we call historical criminology, is our historically situated way of making sense of this relationship that is currently developing between history and criminology. And I think the fact that back in the 70s, people did not really use this designation was the exception rather than the rule. And rather what you have is scholars critiquing a historical criminology instead of saying, I practice historical criminology. It's an interesting sort of datum here. But the point of this exercise was sort of to stay faithful to the spirit of Berkeley and sort of try and connect past and present. So I was interested in sort of finding, as I said, sort of writing a chapter in the history of historical criminology so that perhaps we can learn something today from these past instances. And there's also something to be said about the specificity of historical research back at Berkeley and what it tells us about historical criminology. Was this just one way in which we could still do historical criminology today? I've just given you an idea that there were differences in terms of what happened in the US and the UK. And so you could say, well, then we can expect the same today. There are different ways of doing historical criminology, and we shouldn't get too fixated on a particular way of doing it. But I think that the story of Berkeley also shows quite clearly that the history needs to and tied to the needs of the present. It was the struggle, as I tried to argue earlier, there was something about the political struggles of the 70s that almost necessitated the development, sort of, that created an urge to engage with historical material. And so I think that's a point that's worth keeping in mind, that in a way, even if we do develop different ways of doing historical criminology today, that might simply reflect the fact that there are different present needs that inform these different developments in historical criminology. And if that's the case, I mean, I think it might even be a bit silly to ask the question whether it is time to do more historical criminology if this kind of radical need for history is something that only emerges at particular points in time. If, in other words, we only do history when we do because we have to, then perhaps that is a bit fatalistic in the sense that yeah, we're not really the ones who choose and decide if there is a symbiosis between history and critique and so on. But I think we do need to ask ourselves the question, if we do in fact realize that we're going through a time in a way that is not that dissimilar from the 70s. Sorry. Sorry, I'm done here. So I was going to say, if we do realize that we are indeed in sort of one of these times of crisis, just like colleagues were back in the 70s, then we need to ask ourselves, what kind of histories are we compelled to write today? And you know, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's important that we don't get too fixated on sort of the methods of history and historiography, but rather think about the relationship of history with present politics, if you like. And I know that that can be a bit tricky because, as I've just showed you, in a way, there is an argument to be made that to some extent or another, the Faculty of Criminology was the Berkeley School of Criminology was shut down, might have something to do with the fact that back then radical criminologists were producing historical work. And so to what extent can we sort of popularize this radical approach in historical criminology without risking the shutting down of criminology departments that do historical work? It'd be worth the risk, but I think that the Berkeley School, it's a story that we need to keep in mind. All right. And thank you for your time, and I'm more than happy to answer questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that, Roberto. That was a mammoth of a presentation. And I mean, I hope this doesn't sound cheesy, but it was incredibly timely. I kept thinking of the conversation we had before you got started, and the connections that we can possibly make between the present and that point in time that you just presented on. And I have so many questions I want to ask you. I don't want to hog the floor, so I'll start off by taking chair's prerogative and ask you a couple of questions. So the title of your presentation talked about lessons from Berkeley, and you ended on a note that was sort of double-edged. On the one hand, we have this tool in history that can be, I guess, differentiated or diversified according to needs. But at the same time, there's a real risk, especially when we think of politicization and the current status of higher education in the UK, for instance. So what lessons, especially in the context of an HE that's struggling with corporatization and all that, can we learn from Berkeley? We're being pushed to this pragmatism about, for instance, what conversation recently sort of drove me crazy was one around employability and the need to move away from high thinking and from intellectual thinking and do something practical for students and build bridges for them so that when they leave that their institution, that they're employable because they have practical skills. What lessons can we take from Berkeley? And how can we apply those lessons in this context in the UK, given that we do have different present circumstances, no matter the similarities that we have in common with the States, for instance?
Right, so with regards to employability, I think the story of the school itself is quite telling, because the school was essentially funded as a vocational training center for criminal justice practitioners, right? And so if you think about, I know exactly what you mean when you talk about sort of these emphasis on employability today. It's everywhere. Within the context of criminological education, that used to be the paradigm around sort of the mid-20th century. Even if you sort of look at sort of the founding of the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge in the early 60s, it was partly a sort of a theoretical and intellectual and academic endeavor, but it was part of it was essentially devoted to training practitioners. There was an emphasis on that. And so, yeah, I don't find it particularly surprising, the fact that we're going through this sort of however you want to call it. I don't think it's a stage really, but you know, and in a UK context, this emphasis on employability in the higher education sector goes back to the 60s. It goes back to the Robbins report, essentially, that emphasised the need to educate a workforce for a global economy.
Right.
I think when it comes to the sort of question of the lesson, again, it really depends whether we're talking about historical crim or critical crim. I mean, for critical crim, I think the key lesson is to sort of, we need to reflect on the question of how dangerous history is, because there's a sense in which history is perceived by many to be this kind of conservative, you know, disinterested study of the past, whereas this kind of shows that it can be used in radical ways as a way of doing political activism. From the point of view of historical crime, I think it's the point that I made at the end, which is, how do we deal with the fact that we might actually not be in control of this craft, this thing that we call historical criminology, and as a matter of fact, we only end up doing historical research when there's an urgent need in the present to do it, which is a bit of a paradox, I think, of this sort of notion that there's a symbiosis between history and critique. But yeah, I don't know if that answers, at least
Yes,
some of
it
your.
does. It's an excellent starting point.
Okay,
Guys, don't forget
brilliant.
to write your questions in the chat. You can also use the hand raise function to get our attention. I think we have a question here from Akshaya. Roberto, thank you for your presentation. Has this historical approach also included theoretical critiques of the very history of the discipline of criminology and texts that focus on the taken for granted givenness rather of the discipline's starting point of crime is crime?
Right, sorry, I was reading the comments. So I mentioned that there were some doctoral theses that focused specifically on the history of criminology, and that they were kind of attempts not to just write the history of the discipline, so kind of an institutional or intellectual history. They were designed to, so there were exercises in self-reflection. There were attempts by these scholars to reflect on their own academic and political positionality within a discipline that has historically been problematic. So that would be sort of those doctoral theses are the ones that I would invite you to look at in that regard. But as to the question of sort of challenging the notion that crime is crime, as essentially the critical criminology in its entirety was about sort of challenging this notion. What's more fascinating is the fact that historical work, and even radical historical work in criminology, has actually not taken up the task of demystifying crime in the same way. And so if you think about the most famous historical works in sort of the historical study of crime, they were produced by British Marxist historians who just took for granted that crime was something that the lower classes were doing. All of the work, because it's this kind of this social history orientation, was all about the lower classes and in a way how they were victims of history, okay? But it was intrinsic in that model, the notion that crime is a prerogative of the lower classes. And this is a critique that has emerged more recently through historical works of corporate crime and white collar crime that have basically trying to remedy this problem and sort of show that, look, one of the ways in which you understand that crime is a political phenomenon that needs to be studied historically is by studying, say, the history of corporate crime. It becomes patently obvious.
We have another
I hope that answers. Yeah.
from John Moore.
Sorry, which one?
So at the very bottom, great paper, Roberto.
Oh, yes.
It's there.
I wonder if the UK-US differences are about timing. US criminology was much more widespread and a lot more criminal justice focused, particularly training in the UK, whilst the UK was only in Cambridge, Oxford, and LSE. It was later that it expanded through NSC people and stages some more historical work. Yes, so what I've done for the UK, I've looked at the uses of history all throughout the 20th century. So you can read quite a lot of historical work in the writings of Max Grunert and Radzinovich and Mannheim, who were sort of the only three paid criminologists in the countries in the late 40s, and they were really the big names in the mid-20th century and so on. They were doing essentially legal history more than anything else, so sort of writing bits and pieces of the history of the discipline or the history of criminal justice. But I've looked at the works of every single one of the founding members of the NDC. Mary McIntosh is arguably the one that did most of the historical work, or the sort of most volume of historical work. Paul Rock did bits and pieces of it. You have to, Taylor, Watson, and Young, again, did they really produce historical work? All of them essentially, I think that history was relevant to all of them. They reviewed historical works, they emphasized, they critique historical criminology and so on. But then if you look at the anthologies produced by the NDC, if you look at the works of the founders, it just doesn't seem to be as central to the critical project as it was in the United States. But you are right, I think. So this is a point that I wanted to make, and then I decided not to. One of the differences, I think, is just a matter of size. I just feel like that it's harder in the UK to produce the same amount of volume of historical research and work than it is in the US. And so maybe it's just taking longer for that kind of orientation to transpire and become kind of self-evident. But you're right, there's definitely historical works that were produced. It's just it just doesn't seem to me to be as comprehensive as it was in the US.
We have another question from Henry Yeoman.
Is it Henry?
Do you want me to read it?
Please, Henry, please.
Hi, Roberto. Hi, Esbury. Yeah, I thought it's a great talk. Firstly, Roberto. I mean, it's incredibly rich. All sorts of stuff in there that's fascinating. I suppose I'm just wondering how the closure of the Berkeley School influenced the development of US criminology. Did it inspire others to do critical criminology in this historical way? Did it discourage them because they didn't want to lose their jobs? And I'm kind of thinking about this with a view to this discussion about the comparison of the US and the UK. because I agree with what you're saying about Taylor, Walton, and Young, and those people. But at the same time, I'm struck by the fact that, at least in my estimation, British criminology is now more hospitable to historical research than I think American criminology is. The big British journals all take historical research, they'll all publish it in a way that I don't think is true in the US. And a lot of the most cited criminologists in British journals are historical criminologists. They're people like David Garland. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking through now. That might be due to other things. There may well be other stuff that's happened, but yeah, I wondered if you might kind of reflect on the influence of the closure of the Berkeley School on US criminology.
Well, the obvious influence is that critical criminology lost a sort of an institutional base. So that's essentially sort of my first point. To the extent to which radical work, well, I'm not entirely sure whether some other universities sort of took up the task of doing similar historical work. If there is, I'm just not aware of it. But obviously, then in the 80s, sort of the American Society of Criminology created sort of a critical criminology division, and so little by little, critical crim was re-institutionalized, and then eventually totally normalized, obviously within in that sort of last quarter of the 20th century. So yeah, but it's a good question. But I just don't know about later developments. I mean, as to the question of whether the closure of the school sort of discouraged historic works, that's also something that I don't know. My suspicion is yes, just because academics, they don't want to have trouble, and if you associate historical, that kind of radical historical work with being fired, I'm pretty sure that will discourage some to do it just on that basis. And I mean, and I think that's part of. Sorry, was that a comment?
Yeah, this is Greg Barrick. When you're done,
Hi, Greg.
I would love to jump in and respond to Henry's question. And I'd like to, I like your first paper and I loved your analysis, but I would like to respond to Henry and to some things that you were saying, if I can, when you're done with this question, because I also want to answer some other questions that you've posed, at least from my vantage point as one who taught that course that you're talking about as Tony's assistant, and Hi and Chris Berg and David Matza and Tony, they constituted my doctoral committee and my master's, and I also studied with them as an undergrad. We don't like the term critical criminology. We're radical criminologists. We were taught to do a history of crime and criminology. To this day, back then we were specializing in the historical methodologies. So that was an area that you could choose as an area to be tested for your methodology. You could call yourself a historical criminologist. Dovetailing from that, you were asking about how crucial was the closing of the school with respect to our emphasis on history. It wasn't about our history. It was about our praxis. What you leave out of this analysis is, if you will recall, the bombing of Cambodia, and when the U.S. universities in the spring of 1970 went on strike for 4 months, and we never returned to class that semester. And what stemmed from that and the closing of the school is during those strikes. I'm not sure if your viewers know that the one and only time in American society when we were occupied for 2 weeks and we had to show ID to come and go through the community of Berkeley, while that was going on, Reagan, as governor, and his folk were calling the School of Criminology and looking for legitimation for what they were doing, and we wouldn't give it to them. And that was the issue that resulted in the School of Criminology. If we would have played ball with them, closing down the city for 2 weeks, and would have said that that was reasonable, even though the Berkeley Council at the time was totally opposed. The city council was totally opposed to that. So I think that became the issue. Flash forward to your other question about, did it suppress the study of doing history? I don't know so much as it suppressed it, but when we were forming the Division of Critical Criminology back in 1988 or 89, we discussed for hours whether or not we should be a radical division or a critical division. And we said that critical would be acceptable to Henry's point, and radical would not. So we went with something that we didn't see ourselves as a way of expanding the movement. Critical criminology may or may not be historical. Radical criminology is always historical. Anything I've ever written over the last 4 decades has always been about the history of the present from the perspective of the history of development. In that light, my 2 most recent books, Criminology on Trump and Indicting the 45th President, Boss Trump, the GOP, and what we can do about the state, what we can do about the threat to American democracy. And right now I'm in shock, and I'm in misery, and I'm suffering, and I'm hurting, and I'm depressed, and I really, am debating to do the 3rd book or not, which Rutledge will go with if I want to do the 3rd book, which is the aftermath of this, because the story isn't done. I know I'm digressing, but it's always about history for radical criminologists. For critical criminologists, history may or may not be relevant, depending on what you're doing. I mean, critical, yeah, I guess that's sort of some responses that I have. One thing I wanted to share with the question that you want to go back to Lombroso and his students and the environment versus nurture versus nature kind of question. It was one or the other. Well, recently I was reading a book called Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. Well, that's the Darwin trial, the Scopes trial, and the book is principally about that period of time, but it's mostly about Clarence Darrow and Charles, oh my God, the Cross of Gold speech, who ran for president 3 or 4 times. I'm spacing out at the moment, who was arguing the case for getting rid of the teaching of evolution. While I was reading that, everybody knows Clarence Darrow as a great, lawyer, et cetera, and a very left lawyer in the scheme of things, a labor lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, and on and on. What I discovered, or what was referenced in this book by Brenda Wineapple, was that Clarence Darrow had written a textbook in 1920 and a second edition in 1922 that I was totally unaware of, that I suspect nobody in this conversation or at in this Zoom is aware of. Is anyone aware of Crime, Its Causes and Treatment, subtitled On the Question of Human Conduct? I suspect nobody is. I wasn't.
Well, I thought so that the title without the subtitle, that's essentially the English translation of Lombroso's third volume of Criminal Man.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
what was incorrect if Daryl was here today, because if you read his book, which I'm almost done with, it was really on the question of law and human conduct. The book is as much about law and that, but why I'm digressing to talking about Daryl, if you read this book, he has an integrated analysis, and although he seems to be more of a determinist, and he's very much into heredity and biology, but he's very much into environment, and he's very much into the interaction of the two, and he's a historian from the sense that he goes back to animal behavior and moves through it through time. So I'm just suggesting, if you're going to try and sort out that conversation between the social and Lombroso, you might want to look at what he is saying during the 20s, for example, because people were not really saying that. It was sort of an either or, and it sort of pretty much has been an either or. Anyway, I'll
Yeah.
shut up, but those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks, Greg. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Greg Brock we literally have a living legend here with us today. So I'm extremely thankful for that contribution, Greg. And what you just said there about radical criminology being always historical versus critical crim, not so much. I mean, that's my next paper. Probably just gave me an amazing idea, and I thought I was going to jokingly ask you if you were to end the event, whether you were planning a new book on Trump, given today's unfortunate news. But and finally, with regards to that, the sort of the Lombrosian question, that's exactly what you've just described. There, it's actually not too dissimilar from what I'm trying to argue in a short book that I'm writing at the moment about the way that Lombroso used history. To him, essentially, history did not mean conventional history, such as modern history, the Middle Ages, and antiquity. To him, that history was irrelevant to understanding criminal behavior. What you had to do was to go back to prehistory and sort of look at evolutionary history, if you like. And so, yes, there is a way to say that.
Right, and that's what Daryl does. He's very anthropological about the phenomena.
Yeah, and again, it's something that I'm trying to trace back to Lombroso. This kind of there's a distinction there to be made between natural history and conventional history. And my sense is that the radicals, the members of the radical wing at Berkeley, they were interested in a denaturalized kind of radical history, and not necessarily, definitely not the kind of the way that sort of replicating the way that Lombroso himself engaged with.
Right. And then historically, in the evolution of criminology, integrated theories and integrated approaches began to take off in the 1990s.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned, I don't know if you were there yet, I mentioned this point about unidisciplinarity, because I think that in a rudimentary form, we find a bit of that at Berkeley, this sort of attempt to study crime holistically by combining historical perspective and international perspectives and political economic perspectives. Instead of compartmentalizing the social sciences and say,
absolutely.
So I think that the kind of radical work that you guys were doing back then is sort of a precursor to that.
Right. And many of the people doing that work weren't active in the struggle and in the demonstration. In other words, a lot of the people who were doing that historical work, some of us were on the ground, but some of us were still in the ivory tower, if that makes sense.
Right.
It wasn't one or the other. It was both. And we really had no choice since Tony took over the graduate program after his Child Savers, which he's critiqued 2 or 3 times because it was too liberal and not radical and Marxist enough over time and didn't deal with race correctly. But at that point in time, everybody, we were all doing historical dissertations. The people from Law and Society, the people in administrative criminology weren't participating in any of the doctoral work in the 1960s when the PhDs began, but Law and Society was a presence. But the folks from Law and Society, and I won't name names, who used to have all the students as their followers, Sheldon Messenger, for example, who was the dean of the school at one time. And those folks, they no longer could get anyone to attend their classes or to even, sign up to have them on their committees. And one other thing that I'll throw out as my mind is, reminiscing, that the class A and B that you're talking about, take a guess how many people attended that class who were enrolled. Anyone know? 1,000 people from every discipline. Why did they come to criminology? We were considered the cop shop on campus. We were law enforcement type. Why did they come? Because there had been a purge in academia since Reagan got on board in '66, and all the untenured lefties were eliminated. So there wasn't a forum left on campus, or there were a few people left on campus who were radical or Marxist. So they had no choice but to come to the School of Crim. That's the only place, because we were the last group, that you would have thought of. But we became center stage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And
Okay.
just one final comment,
quiet.
Esmori, because I suspect that we need to end the meeting
Sure.
very
I'm sorry.
shortly. No, please, Greg. Again, very much appreciate your contribution. I just wanted to clarify. Obviously, you're absolutely correct when you mentioned earlier that the school ultimately was shut down because you guys were doing radical activist work. It wasn't because of the history. But I thought it was an interesting question to pose. To what extent sort of history was part of this radical attitude more generally, and therefore up to what point was it implicated in sort of the fact that the kind of work that you were doing came to be seen in sort of in a negative light by the politically powerful individuals and so on. And sort of something else that is also worth exploring is the fact that one thing that I've noticed by comparing the US situation, what you guys were doing at Berkeley in the 70s with what was happening in the UK, and sort of studying the interaction of, say, Marxists and radicals with law and society scholars in both countries, it's interesting that in many ways, law and society scholarship in the UK in the 70s actually took a historical turn that influenced the critical criminologists in the 70s, mid-70s. I mean, just think about Pat Carlin work on the early factory acts and the early factory legislation. That's essentially.
I agree. I mean, Tony got his funding from the Law and Society. I was a research assistant being paid by Law and Society. And yes, they were sympathetic, but when they were inside the School of Criminology, they were more, functionaries. They were more, they didn't question the legality of crime. They didn't, broach structural criminality. They didn't know what we were talking about when we talked about the crimes of racism, sexism, and imperialism. That was a foreign object to them. And that's what sort of severed the two. one more thing, if I can, about the radical nature. If you probably never heard of Norvell Morris, the honest
I have.
the honest guide to a politician's,
Yes,
criminality, something like that. He was offered the job to become the
yes,
dean of the School of Crim, and that
I'm
never
aware of that.
materialized. Why? Because the Union of Radical Criminologists sent him a death threat notice that it wouldn't be safe for him to come on campus. And with that, the
I
School of
didn't know about that particular
Criminology
detail.
days were numbered.
Right, right. I didn't know about that particular detail, Greg. Thank you for sharing. I knew about Noel and the fact that he was one of the candidates and so on, but he eventually he just didn't. Uh, it didn't. I didn't know that this is why. Well, that explains it a lot. And by the way, with regards to your comments about law and society at Berkeley, I completely get what you're saying. I'm just saying that we need to be careful not to essentialize all of these different, again, study areas, because what was happening in law and society in the UK seems to be a bit different in terms of
Oh, okay. I'm
yes.
sorry. I misspoke. I thought you were really making reference to the Center for Law and Society,
No, no, no.
which was an arm of the Berkeley School of Law.
Yes, yes, yes. So I was making a comparison between the
Oh,
two,
okay.
and I'm
I
saying that
misunderstood.
yeah,
Okay.
that in the UK, law and society scholarship by the mid 70s had undergone some kind of historical turn, and so you can find lots and lots of law and society, British law and society scholarship that is historical in orientation, unlike the kind of work produced by law and society scholars in the mid 70s at Berkeley.
And
Was
what
what I was.
role do you look at with the Birmingham School? How does that play in? Because there were critical criminologists at the Birmingham School who were around in the 70s as well.
But you're talking about the Center of Cultural Studies, yeah.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah,
They seem to be in the game.
yes. I've also looked at them in some of my explorations of sort of the similar dynamics in the UK. And as the common thread is the following. You look at the mission statement of the center, and they will tell you that their interest is in sort of culture and history. History is always part of what they say they're going to do. So it was the same with um, sort of the most well-known names in critical criminology in Britain at the time, like Taylor, Walton, and Young. I used a couple
Sure.
of quotes earlier where they basically say crime is a historical phenomenon. The analysis of crime outside history and society is meaningless. But then you look at their work, and there's no comprehensive historical scholarship that was produced.
I agree with you.
So that's why I sort of raised the issue earlier. So why
Sure.
is it they did not really practice what they preached? They all claimed the history was essential to what they were doing, but then they did not produce the same volume of historical work that you guys did at Berkeley, which is why I
And
kind
then
of
Taylor and
yeah,
Walton and company went into realist criminology, and
yeah,
they forgot all about history.
exactly. And don't ask me why that happened, but it probably had to do with sort of British politics in the 80s and so on. But that's also something. As a matter of fact, I did ask that question to myself, because when I was looking at their work from the 70s, and again, over and over again, they emphasize that there's a problem with an ahistorical criminology. But then you check at that work over the 80s and 90s, and as you rightly pointed out, they moved into fields that did not capitalize on this kind of historical point, that like left realism, or in the case of Chok Yang in particular, a kind of cultural criminology that is very much ahistorical, the way he's been practicing it. And so that's a bit of it remains a bit of a mystery to me. But it seems to be, I think the explanation that I provide is kind of the one that I mentioned in the presentation, that we do history when we do because we have to, and there was a bit of an impetus to do history back in the 70s because of the influence of Marxism and historical materialism, and the fact that all of the different struggles against sexism and racism and oppression of all kinds and so on kind of necessitated to inquire into our history to better position ourselves in the political field in that present moment.
I think that's spot on.
And for some reason, the 80s and 90s, you know, I don't, you know, I still have to write that chapter of the history of historical criminology, if you like. I need to figure out more conclusively what happened in the 80s and 90s, and sort of early 2000s, because it seems to me as though interest kind of declined. Tony Platt wrote a paper in 2008 where he essentially complained about the fact that the kind of fervor for history that was there at the Berkeley School in the 70s had virtually gone, and it's kind of, I'm kind of excited about the fact that these days there seems to be more interest in this notion of a historical criminology, but I still have question marks as to where this project is taking us and why we're doing it. And so I think that's why I appreciate Asmari for organizing these events, because this is exactly the kind of venues that will enable us to have these conversations and the kinds of engagements that will help us figure out what we're doing. But you've been doing this stuff, Greg, for your whole life, as you said. I mean, every single book I've read of yours, there's always a historical chapter in it. I mean, you're an exemplar in many ways to what I take to be a historical sort of a, what I've called critical historical criminology. I know you don't like the
No, that's okay. I just don't like them being interchangeable.
Right.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I debated whether to call my memoir Chronicles of a Radical or Chronicles of a Critical, and even Rutgers University Press and Michael Lowski wrote the preface to that, and it was in his book series. But even even at that time, they said, "Are you sure you want to call yourself a radical criminologist?" I said, "You bet I do." You know. Anyway, enough about that.
Thank you both for that. Thank you for everyone for a very lively discussion. And Berto, I look forward to reading the paper or the book, whatever product you define this product at the end. I think this is a key moment to say thank you for coming. I'll stop the recording actually.